We're going to start things off, actually just go down the row real quick and have everybody in the panel is just going to introduce themselves. I'll start with introductions. My name is Chris Schildt. I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink based in Oakland, California.
Hello, my name is Nicole Johnson, Community Engagement Manager with 1000 Friends of Oregon in Portland, Oregon.
My name's Tony Lamb. I work the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
I'm Gregory Davis. I'm the Managing Strategist for the Rainier Beach Action Coalition right here in Southeast Seattle.
Hi, I'm Monica Bravo, and I am the Executive Director of the Westside Community Organization in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Hi, my name is Katie Topinka. I'm the Housing Policy Coordinator with the City of Minneapolis Department of Community Planning and Economic Development.
So then you all probably heard me say my organization, PolicyLink, we are a nonprofit organization that works to advance racial and economic equity. My work over the last year and a half has been the privilege to work with 11 different cities around the country as a part of the All-In Cities Anti-Displacement Policy Network. So three of those cities actually are here tonight. We have Portland and Minneapolis and St. Paul, who formed a joint team of the Twin Cities. But we also worked with San Jose, Santa Fe, Denver, Austin, Texas, Nashville, Boston, Buffalo, around the country, different cities that included local elected officials, city staff, and community-based organization partners that formed teams in each of these cities and spent a year working together, both in their city teams, but across the different cities as well, learning from each other and talking about what does it mean to really develop an anti-displacement practice in their cities and be able to advance anti-displacement strategies. So you all will get to hear a bit from the cities here tonight about the work that they're doing in their places. Before I turn it over to some questions that I have for them all, I did want to say a little bit. This panel tonight is about anti-displacement strategies. And I think we oftentimes hear a conversation of, well, what is it that we're concerned about? Are we talking about displacement? Are we talking about gentrification? What is displacement? So I want to offer up a quote from Manuel Pastor. He's a professor down at University of Southern California. And he defines displacement as about power. Power over the market, over policy, and over the meaning of place. Displacement is the erasure of cultural meaning. And I think that that's such an important way to ground the conversation when we're talking about displacement, that fundamentally what we're talking about is who gets to make the decisions for their community and for their own lives and their family, who gets to stay in their home and have a choice to stay in that home or move if they want, but also who gets to shape the future of what happens in their neighborhood. What happens with their local businesses, what happens in their streets, in their parks, in their community. And displacement is not a new phenomenon. As we talked about this morning and as we saw with the welcoming, the indigenous welcoming of us to this land, displacement is something that has been rooted in the beginning in the founding of this country and before we were a country in the original colonization and indigenous genocide. And it's something that's continued on to the present day through policy that, frankly, some of us, I'm a planner by profession, and the planning profession has been deeply involved in displacement of communities over generations, of redlining and blockbusting and creating racially exclusionary zoning and then class-based exclusionary zoning. And through to the affordable housing crisis that we face today in many of our communities. So this is something that has been a long time developing in our communities, and it's not something that we can unlearn or undo in just a short time, in just 1 year. But will take decades and frankly generations. But we start now, right? And we work on rebuilding our institutions and our policies so that we're moving from a frame of extracting wealth and extracting power from communities of color to really centering those who have been impacted by those policies in making these decisions. When we talk about displacement, I like to break down what are some of the main drivers of displacement and break that down into 4 different categories. So we talk about direct displacement, which many people might be familiar with, of the practice of, for example, urban renewal, of when the government literally comes in, takes somebody's home, or through public action, we force somebody to move out of their home. Likewise, evictions, when people are forced to move out of their homes due to private market actors. And also to name incarceration as a form of direct displacement. That when we lock folks up, we're taking them out of the communities, out of their homes. And so that is a form of direct displacement. We also talk about indirect, or sometimes it's called economic displacement, which is a question of who can afford to live in a community. So if you had to move out of your apartment or wanted to move out of your apartment for whatever reason, could you afford another home in that same neighborhood? Or is your rent rising so much that you can no longer afford to pay your rent? That is oftentimes can be influenced by what are the investments going on in your community more generally. So even when you might have a new park or a dirty river that's been cleaned up, or new infrastructure coming in that you've long wanted in your community, and now suddenly rents are rising and you can't afford to live in that community anymore. Another form of displacement is cultural displacement. And that might be, even if you still live in your community, is it the community that you knew and were able to access resources? Do you know your neighbors? Are you able to walk down the street and not be harassed or not have somebody call the police on you because you look suspicious? Do the local businesses in your community provide the goods and the services that you need in your day-to-day life? And then finally, we talk about climate displacement. And this is something that, as climate change is affecting us across the country, and I'll say I'm in Oakland, I'm in California, and we just experienced throughout Northern California power outages that forced many people to move out of their homes because they didn't have power anymore. Also fires that have forced mass evacuations. And now we have places that are fire prone, those homeowners can't get insurance. Likewise in flood prone areas, and as disaster climate events have happened in community, how are people able to move back and rebuild and recover their communities, and are they able to do so? Oftentimes we know that gentrification or displacement can happen in the wake of a climate event. So keeping all of those different frameworks in mind of how displacement happens in a community and really dispossesses somebody of the power to live in and shape their community and have their needs met. And that's the theme of what we're talking about tonight. And what are the strategies that we can do to try to stop displacement and reverse displacement, and ultimately to build thriving communities for all. So that's my first question to the panel, actually, is that we talk a lot about fighting displacement or addressing it, stopping it. But also many of us are working to do things that are actually about building a thriving, equitable place for everyone in the community. And so what is it that each of you is doing to create or to build a more equitable community?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for having us here tonight. So I work with an organization called 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and like I said this morning, it was born out of our signing of Senate Bill 100, which created our statewide planning goals and also established our urban growth boundary. And so our organization was really created to make sure that there was basically a watchdog to make sure that governmental agencies implemented what they said they were going to implement. And right now what we're doing in terms of creating resilient and equitable communities is really, and I guess I'll talk about this more for the kind of specific questions, but working to achieve affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and equitable access to parks and nature. And so pushing to advance public investments in affordable housing and transportation, and also helping in coalition building and being in coalition with grassroots community organizations to help uplift those goals that we have.
Yeah, so in my role with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, we're really trying to work on who we center in our decision-making process, who we're communicating with, who we're listening to, who we're allowing to make decisions, I think is a really big one in making sure the outcomes that we see really center the communities we want to help. Changing the way that we do business as normal, as government, I think is a really big one for us in trying to see those outcomes that we would like to see in particular. And I think working across silos. We often have really large silos and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so sometimes when Bureau may be trying to do good work, but not realizing that they have an impact on the broader community because we're not talking and working together. So really trying to work across those silos.
Yeah, so I've been kind of dubbed the elder up here, and so I got certain liberties, and one of them is to say that we do what they said. But the other is, I'm actually have come to a point in this conversation about equity to redefine it, particularly for among the uninitiated, but surely among those who purport to it. And so I kind of got confirmation of the value of this as a result of the last panel with Sister Christie up here and that Brown Girl Catering, when the notion of equity was applied to the support she got to be able to post her business in a place, the training, the resource she got to do it, that was called equity. And I say that's just fairness. That's just what's right. Yeah. So we're applying this term equity to things that are just what should be done because of histories of underinvestment. So I'm calling it equity plus plus because it's the equity is what happens after that happens, right? To help sustain her into that place. And at this point, though, people would say to her, oh no, the way that you're going to be sustained is you're going to make profit. You're going to sustain your business, but that's hard. The equity is really the cash down payment to help her sustain that business for, if she didn't make any more money for another 2 years. That's equity. Because we've just had such a historical experience of not having it, this notion of what's fair seems to be this whole hill that we climb, that now we're there, everything's gonna be fine. So that's one of the tasks that I'm taking up of late when it comes to how to build a more equitable community and neighborhood is to redefine that term equity so that we understand that, really more what it needs to be.
Thank you. So we are a small nonprofit in the city of St. Paul. As I said this morning, we're one of the 17 district planning councils in the city, and we work on quality of life issues and systemic change and through traditional organizing methodologies, both at the grassroots and the grass top. We work on multiple issues, but in particular for this discussion, we have drafted and adapted what's called the Equitable Development Scorecard. And so it's been a 2-year process. A little snapshot of our neighborhood, we're 50% persons of color, we're 50% renters. We've been dubbed 75% area of concentrated poverty. There's a long story behind that, and I think more to come. So,
Thank you. So as Chris mentioned, Minneapolis and St. Paul had a joint team as part of the Policy Link Anti-Displacement Policy Network. And Monica was on the St. Paul side, I was on the Minneapolis side, along with, both of our teams had a couple of city council members from each city, a few other city staff, and a few other representatives from community organizations. And that work really has been driving a lot of the policies that the city of Minneapolis is undertaking around preventing displacement. We've been getting a lot of attention nationally for our new comprehensive plan that eliminates single-family zoning across the city, which is a big accomplishment and really centered on trying to undo past racist policies, redlining and racist covenants. But in addition to, so we've been getting a lot of attention for that piece of it, but there is also a goal around preventing displacement in our comprehensive plan, and that's helping to drive a lot of other work that's going on in the city. The work from our Anti-Displacement Policy Network team also is leading to a lot of work around tenant protections in the city of Minneapolis. We are a majority renter city. 89,000 households in the city are renters. So recently our council adopted a fair chance housing access ordinance related to tenant screening criteria. We are now starting work on a tenant opportunity to purchase ordinance looking at a number of different policies around tenant protections and preventing displacement.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to first go to Gregory, actually, and I really appreciated what you were saying there about the need to, about seeing equity really as just fairness, right? And doing what's right. One of the things that I really love about the Rainier Beach Action Coalition has been how comprehensive your all's work is. It spans from housing to culture to transportation to economic development, social services and education, all of these areas. Can you talk a little bit about why you take such a holistic approach to these questions of equity or what you might say fairness?
Sure, but just one point, equity is not fairness. Equity is what you get after you get fairness, right? That's why I said equity plus plus. So, equity plus plus. Yeah, so doing what's right is being referred to as equity. But that's not equity, that's just doing what's right. That's just doing what's fair. The equity is the plus plus after that, okay? Yeah. So again, Gregory Davis, I'm managing strategist for the Rainier Beach Action Coalition. It's a small nonprofit in Rainier Beach. We steward the Rainier Beach Neighborhood Plan. And of late, I've been saying more and more, we hire young people to implement the Rainier Beach Neighborhood Plan, and maybe I'll provide a few examples of that. So I come by it honestly in terms of holistic because I'm from an African people, and culturally that is just a natural way that African people exist, is being holistic. Just kind of doing what I do just is one way that just kind of has me in that space. But we are also a place-based organization. So when we look at Rainier Beach, we got about 10,000 people from a radius of 1 mile from the center of the neighborhood, 44% Asian, 40% African American, 15% white, 7% Latino, about 16 different languages spoken, about 44% of the folks are renters, 25% are under the age of 18. So when you're place-based, it's almost an imperative that you have to be holistic because there are so many varied needs in the neighborhood among the people who live there that you can't just be one issue oriented. But the other thing that we were really committed to as an organization was being a coalition and then being in coalition. So being holistic kind of compels you to do coalition work because as an organization we can't do everything on our own. We do specialize in public safety and food justice work, but when it comes to economic development, we have to rely on the Rainier Beach Merchants Association. when it comes to education, we have to rely on the Southeast Seattle Education Coalition. But that's one of the substances that I think that grounds us as an organization, is that we do coalition work, and therefore we're able to have a broader reach. There's one story that I kind of wanted to share to give more clarity about why that's important. And it's really a sad story. And just talk about this work with displacement. I mean, ultimately, it's not going well, right? So we have a board member who is in a vocational rehab situation because of PTSD from being an Army vet. The rent on his apartment that he and his 12-year-old daughter were living in went up $400. So there we got an economic development issue. We got a workforce readiness issue. They had to relocate and wound up in Sandpoint. Now, I'm not sure how many are familiar with Seattle, but Sandpoint is just on the north end of University of Washington. So from here, that's a decent little ways. That's a transportation issue. So now he's got to get back to his to where he lives, or used to live, and where he was comfortable from Sandpoint. His daughter now needs to catch a bus to the light rail station, catch the light rail to downtown, catch a bus up to Washington Middle School. So that's an education issue. That's a transportation issue. So you see how all these things kind of come into play, and why it's important to be holistic, because anybody that comes to us that has a need is not a one-issue person. And so that makes it tougher to do, but that's why it's really important to do coalition work. Just one other example of the importance, and this is the young people impress these words on us, intersectionality. We got young people who don't eat the meals at their high school because they don't like the way they taste. So they go to the local grocery store and maybe in there looking for food and wind up shoplifting. And then the grocery store owner calls the police on them. So here you got public safety, you got food justice, you got education, all kind of coming into play, impacting it. So being holistic is an imperative.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. And now I want to ask this to the two folks here from Portland around the work that you all have done this summer in developing an anti-displacement action plan. And if you all just want to talk a little bit about that and what that is and the process that got the city and the community to this point.
I'll start. So I think how the story began was kind of goes back to our review and creation of our comprehensive plan of 2035, and just some advocates and some people in our community that were just kind of keeping track of what was going on in the city, looked and saw in the plan there weren't any equitable outcomes or equitable policies to make sure that those outcomes were there. And so it kind of happened as a call for action. Someone, a really incredible advocate, housing advocate, at the time was working at 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and kind of called, the local people, community organizations together and said, hey, here's an issue in our comprehensive plan. If we don't keep track and influence, this is going to be bad for Portlanders. And so they came together, created, through just a large coalition, created, I believe, 11 policies, and just pushed that on the city. And it was, building coalition takes time, and so it was kind of late in the game. I believe the city was about to vote on their comprehensive plan, and that our community leaders just said, well, sounds like we're going to do a direct action. And so incredibly, they dropped a banner that said end anti-displacement, and had a cake and interrupted the city meeting and got the attention of city leaders to where they began to work together and were able to put those policies in the comp plan. And now, so that was 2014, 2015. And so now that we have some kind kind of zoning code changes that the city is thinking about implementing. Once again, the coalition kind of came together around those, and I think some other, I have some gaps in the story, sorry. But now with the city participating in the Anti-Displacement Policy Link cohort, coming together to be able to create a task force and also help resource the Anti-Displacement PDX Coalition so that they could participate more fully, just because it was all volunteer based, and 2 staff that were able to, at the time, from different organizations, dedicate their time to working on getting those policies in the comp plan. But now kind of things have changed. People have shifted positions, and so getting that actual coalition resource instead of having someone just who cared from a organizational standpoint, so that there could be full participation. Do you want to talk about the task force?
Yeah, I'll also add that a lot of that groundwork actually began in 2012 with our Portland plan. The Portland plan laid out equity as a strategy that the city must pursue in development of policy and projects. So that kind of really laid the groundwork. And as Gregory has said, that was probably more just doing the right thing, not so much equity. And I guess I would see some of the stuff coming out of the 2035 comp plan and this anti-displacement, the action plan being more of the plus, and hopefully what comes out of that being the plus. Yeah, so those 11 policies that were incorporated into our comprehensive plan, 2030 comprehensive plan, 2014, 2015. Going through this anti-displacement action plan, we've actually kind of realized that thinking has changed. We've progressed a lot in understanding what displacement is. Those 11 action items were centered around housing displacement. As we've come to focus on now, there's actually business and cultural and climate displacement as well. So within the comprehensive plan, there are 50 policies that are kind of in that wheelhouse of anti-displacement / equity. I've gotten to know quite a few of those by hand, having run through recently an inventory that we're utilizing for our anti-displacement action plan that city bureaus are doing or that we should be doing, and really kind of scoring those against our comprehensive plan. How can they be met? Where's the justification in our comprehensive plan for doing these types of things that ensure that folks are kept in place? Yeah, and you mentioned the task force. That's a really, I also want to mention one other thing. The banner drop that happened, the In Displacement Now, actually happened in the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability's building. So as planners showed up to work, there were banners on 3 or 4 different levels of the building. I said, In Displacement Now. I was still in grad school at the time, so it was absolutely amazing. But yeah, with the task force, and I'll talk about this a little more, some follow-up questions, but trying to develop this task force that has, that is the decision-making table. That's not a kiddie table. That's not a place where we bring preformed plans and thoughts and policies and ideas and get a stamp of approval, because that's not what we're shooting for. But this being an actual place where community is resourced, that their wisdom, the things that they bring to the table, that lived experience, those connections, that is what is making the decisions. Where we invest, how we invest, why we invest. Hopefully that there's veto power over things that as a city we think we should do, or as quote unquote professionals we think we should do, but that community is empowered, enabled to say no, that's not what you should do. You should actually do this, and that we follow through with that. So that's some things that I'm really excited about the anti-displacement action plan, and we're kind of in the founding stages of this, and again, I'll talk a little more about some particulars on that.
So I want to hear you talk about what, from your perspective sitting in city, what has your experience been like to actually operationalize centering impacted communities and bringing community groups into a decision-making body like this? What are some of the tensions or challenges that have come up, and how have you worked through them?
Yeah, I'll talk quickly maybe about a few different things throughout the city. So not just maybe the anti-displacement action plan and the task force, but things that some other bureaus have also done that I think are important in centering community. Our Portland Clean Energy Fund was a really big one. If you're not familiar, last year, there's a broad group of community coalitions who wanted to tax big business that operate in our city, tax them a 1% tax on all sales in Portland. That money going to a fund, the Clean Energy Fund, that would support communities of color economically. So often in this anti-displacement work, we're talking about housing, but for me, that holistic approach, you need to have the housing funding and you need to have the economic development funding. So these groups came together. They got a ballot measure last year on. It was approved by 65% of voters in the city to tax those large retailers by 1%. It's projected to raise $54 to $71 million a year, every single year, forever. And that money going to communities of color explicitly, that is in the language, that is who that will support. 40 to 60% of that money will go to clean energy programs and projects. 20 to 25% will go to workforce development. 10 to 15% will go to green infrastructure and 5% to innovation. So this is a clear example of, and I will also say, so it's not the city that centers community. We're responding to requests and demands from the community to center community. That's the only reason we do that, hopefully when we listen. So that's an example. I think the right to return is another great example. Policy by our Housing Bureau to allow Black African-American families who have traditional ties to what was the traditional Black community to be able to come back into housing. I think that's a great policy. Something else, our Prosper, who's in charge of our economic development, last year they paused funding that's being taken through a tax increment financing. Community Oversight Committee said, hey, we aren't sure where this money is going, who's actually benefiting from this money. We want you to stop funding any economic development efforts until you come back with us with disaggregated data on who's actually benefiting from this money. We want to make sure it's the intended communities. And Prosper listened. They paused. They brought data back to that group to be able to show where that money is going and to reassess that program. Challenges are probably similar challenges that we face everywhere. The transfer of power and giving that decision-making over to community is really tough. I think some of the funding issues of knowing that we could, will, should be funding groups who are going to be pressing us and holding us accountable. And sometimes that's tough, right? To know that you are funding those groups who are really gonna hold your feet to the fire to make sure you follow through with what you're supposed to do. I think slowing down and running on community time, that's a big issue. We feel like we have reports. We're accountable to folks that we need to make sure we're doing something. But if community isn't in that place to be able to meet our report deadlines, then we've got to pause and we've got to come back and say, hey, council, hey, director, hey, mayor, right now we need to make space for community to ensure they have that time to organize and be ready to come to the table, to set the table for us to come to make those decisions. Yeah.
Thank you. And before we leave Portland, I want to bring one question back to Nicole. And that is, when you're talking about the 1,000 Friends of Oregon and kind of the roots of your organization in maybe environmental work, you could say, how do you bring an anti-displacement lens or strategies into the environmental justice work that you do?
Thank you. I think kind of the special thing about 1,000 Friends of Oregon is that we are not issue-based, and so we work, to ensure our goals of our statewide planning goals, and we have 19 of them, so it's a lot of work. But what's so special is that we bridge silos. And so with our affordable housing, with our sustainable transportation, and with our parks and nature, that's a livable community. That's a community that has a good quality of life if all of those things are included. And so that means that we're at those tables. We're at the tables where they're talking about affordable housing, and then we're making comments about, well, if you're going to have affordable housing, let's make sure that housing is located very close to transit. And then it's in walkable distance of economic development, so that in your community you can walk to the grocery store, not just the corner store, but the grocery store that has, safe food, that, has a farmer's market or something like that. In the neighborhoods where it might be low-income neighborhoods, making sure that there's access to a park nearby, so because that also helps quality of life as well. So when we're in the transportation conversations, we're talking about trails in nature to make sure that those, talking about active transportation, making sure we're making all of those connections. Something that we're, as 1,000 Friends of Oregon is working on right now is helping to push our transit organization to use their surplus of land to do transit-oriented development. So to be able to, yes, I heard a yes. So to be able to use that land to either provide at a very low rate or just, hand over to affordable, developers to be able to create create affordable housing, because we know that their land, most of the time it's park and rides or, just empty lots that is close to all of the necessities of having a livable neighborhood. So if they can put affordable housing in that area, make it dense, everybody's happy. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. Well, we've heard from Seattle and talking about the importance of being holistic, because people don't live their lives in just one issue area, but all of these issue areas are deeply connected in terms of people being able to live and thrive. We've heard from Portland and talking about some of the ways that they've been responding to community demands, really, to incorporate equity, not just in terms of the policies passed, but in terms of the funding decisions that are getting made and how decisions are getting made. I want to turn it over now to the Twin Cities, both Minneapolis and St. Paul at the end there, and talk a little bit about narrative frameworks and specifically as a part of the Anti-Displacement Policy Network. One of the things that I know I learned from the Twin Cities was just how important and powerful narrative frameworks are. Oftentimes I hear people say that a weak market city or neighborhood can't experience displacement or gentrification, and say, oh, well, that's, they need investment. Any kind of investment is good investment in a place like that. And so I'm wondering if you can say, what are the narratives that we need to change around displacement and equitable development, and how have you all been working to change those narratives in the Twin Cities?
Okay. Thinking a little bit about this and some of the conversations that we had in our cohort, let me go back to a statistic that I threw out. I think I said 75% of our neighborhood was an area of concentrated poverty. So that terminology right there, area of concentrated poverty, defines it's a narrative, right? It defines a group of people in a deficit. So if we're going to continue to use that language, we were trying to come up with something different, right? But if we're going to continue to use that language, then why don't we talk about areas of concentrated white wealth in just the same way? So it's about flipping how we talk about each other and understanding that community, when community comes to the table, super excited to hear what Portland is doing inside of your city, whoa. And also when community comes to the table, they're viewed as the experts of their lived experience, just as there are planning experts and architectural experts. These are community practitioners. They have the lived experiences, and we know that data always lags the human experience. And so the people on the ground are always closest to what's happening first, before the data catches up to them. So when we talk about shifting the narrative, we need to talk about how we are defining from a deficit-based individuals and how we're defining individuals from an asset space. And so I think Katie can help a little bit more with this conversation. But the one thing I wanted to mention was we had a large developer come in. It was as we were building our scorecard, so riding and building the bike at the same time. And they were going to build high-end luxury price point apartments in this area. Long history there too, just a lot of history of displacement in the area. Previously historic, decades of disinvestment. And so, we were not going to have it. And so as we were organizing around that, one of our senior planning officials at the city, basically said, we can't put affordable housing there because it's already a concentrated area of poverty. And so again, like when you go back to thinking about, what was maybe intended for some good purpose actually has been very detrimental. So thinking about how narratives play out and the things that narratives bring with them. I'm sure there was more I wanted to say, but I'll pass on.
Thank you. And I think Monica set that up really well. In our cohort, we did just have a lot of conversations about how to reframe the narrative and talk about communities starting with asset-based language rather than deficit-based language. And that work started before our anti-displacement policy network cohort started meeting, partly because the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul were sued over their analysis of impediments for fair housing. And partly the complaint was over potentially too much investment in so-called concentrated areas of poverty, and whether that was a fair housing issue. And as a result of the lawsuit, there was a settlement, and I didn't work directly on this, so I'm not the expert on it, but a number of community organizations came to the table and really pushed to separate the community. So the settlement was that the cities would write a new or an addendum to the analysis of impediments, and a number of community organizations formed a group called Equity in Place, and really represented community organizations that work directly with communities of color, and pushed to separate the community engagement work from the data analysis work of the analysis of impediments, and to really make sure that voices of communities of color were represented in that analysis of impediments. And as a result, it was a pretty strong addendum to that, and actually displacement was named as a fair housing issue in that analysis, the addendum to the analysis of impediments. And then just maybe one other example around reframing the narrative. As I mentioned earlier, Minneapolis over this fall actually adopted a fair chance access to housing ordinance, which was limiting the ability of property owners and managers to screen for things like criminal history, credit score, and eviction history. And one of the arguments from some of the folks lobbying against the ordinance was that the city didn't have enough data to show that if property owners weren't screening for those things, that there wasn't going to be, increased negative outcomes in the housing, or more issues related to housing success. And I think community organizations were really able to kind of flip that narrative and talk about all of the data that exists, that the incarceration rates for communities of color, and particularly African American communities in this country, we have that data. We have data that women of color in particularly are adversely affected by eviction. And we have data that communities of color disproportionately have lower credit scores than white people. And so it was, again, just a way to shift the narrative, and that ordinance passed unanimously earlier this year and will go into effect next year. And as it goes into effect, we'll probably be able to get more data to see what housing outcomes look like. But anyway, it's just a conversation we had a lot at our Anti-Displacement Policy Network, and I think it's come to fruition in different city plans and as we've worked toward passing new policies.
I think I can just quickly add to that. So St. Paul, sister city to Minneapolis, Twin Cities, just across the bridge from each other. But now before January, or maybe right into the new year, we're also passing a six new tenant protection laws that are very similar to the laws that were passed in Minneapolis, and we're very excited about that. And then just thinking too that, I guess my final thoughts around narrative shift is just always trying to amplify and lift up the human experience and that the individual as a human being. So we always get caught up in numbers and in data, and we're talking about 50%, 60%, 80% of the AMI, but we're really talking about people's lives. And so just never forget to lift up the human in it.
We're seeing tremendous work happen in your cities, in cities across the country, to advance tenant protections, to increase funding for affordable housing. This last election cycle, we saw over $1 billion in new housing funds pass in cities around the country to go towards housing trust funds, to go towards affordable housing production. Community ownership, we're seeing a rise in community land trusts. Business and cultural stabilization, we've heard strategies around throughout the day today of how folks are doing that and supporting local businesses and small businesses. And yet, we're still facing an incredible crisis in our communities around displacement, centered on, I would argue, the affordable housing crisis and displacement for renters and for low-income or fixed-income homeowners, but also in our businesses community as well. And so I guess my question to you all is the question that I ask myself all the time, which is what are we doing wrong? What are we not seeing that's preventing us from really moving the solutions forward that would address this and actually solve this problem in our communities? What do we need? Are we doing something that we need to stop doing? Are we doing something that we need to be doing more of and be bolder in? What do you think it will actually take so that we're not just responding to this crisis, but we actually see stability and prosperity in our communities?
Are you giving it up?
I mean, I can answer it. I mean, yes,
Yeah,
I'll
go
share
ahead.
this mic, and also I agree with you. I think that we need courage and boldness in all of our respected roles from the top, and especially in senior leadership and middle leadership. Everywhere you are, we need courageous, bold leadership that isn't afraid to talk about racism, because we know that these are all, we're in this position because of our racist history, and we can only change it through courageous and bold moves. That's what I think we're needing to amplify and needing to push.
It's so important, I think, to that question that we don't blame the victim. We make sure that we don't do that. But I think we are not understanding how pervasive the oppression is and what it has been. I'm reading a book called Black Wealth, White Wealth, and it has 3 elements in it that it puts out as to the depth of the challenge we have. One is we have a large group of people who just value income and not wealth. And our society, particularly in low-income communities, communities of color, that's what the motto is, to value income and not wealth. And, when you pull out financial literacy from the schools, it kind of helps perpetuate that, which kind of speaks to the other issue, and that's the state-authorized oppression that happens. An example of the story that I gave about the young man who who's in vocational rehab on because of PTSD, they have a cap on how much money he can earn. He can't work any more than 10 hours a week because there's this sense that he can't handle more than that. So it kind of affects, so this is a state authorized, approved practice. I think the other one that the book mentions is sedimentation of all of this, that then it just becomes deep-rooted, it becomes generational. And the ability to rise up out of that, I don't think the common person kind of understands just the challenge that is. So I think that's one of the reasons is this idea of just, we need a Marshall Plan. You know, we just need to feed dollars in. Now, how much worse can we do than what is already has occurred? So, you know, whatever people's fear is about doing the equity plus in these communities, you know, it can't be much worse than, you know, creating the deficit we got right now in our country, made by folks who apparently are smarter than most. So yeah, I think we just need to get a grasp on reality. There's more of us who are struggling to get by than we are given credit for.
The first thing I'll say is, and this is a thought that's increasingly been on my mind, that a lot of our models of change are built on perpetuating the current system of exploitation and inequity. And that's a hard thing to say, right? Like, yeah, our tax system, right? It's set up that we perpetuate a system of inequity, right? You need wealth and you need to continue to generate income to be able to tax something, right? So you continue in a system of exploitation to be able to get that money to create tiny change over here. I think we go after crumbs. We don't go after larger sections of the pie. And we take piecemeal approaches. We're uncoordinated. We don't have a cohesive and holistic strategy to create change. Everyone is kind of in their own lane, or when you are thinking holistically, it's crumbs that we're given or that we can access. And so, yeah, we're just operating in a system that is working the way it was meant to work.
I think maybe the last thing I'll say is maybe it's also the mindset, because I know that some of the work that I've seen is just kind of, well, time or change takes so much time. Let's just do this little piece, and then we know 5 years down the road we'll add some more, and then 5 years down the road we'll add some more, and then after 10 years it'll be this great amazing thing. And I think that's going after the crumbs. That's just getting what we can get right now instead of waiting to get, you know, the whole, like you said, the whole pie. So maybe it's just that mindset.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add, I think what everyone said is great, and I don't know, I have a lot to add to it, except that I do think there is a lot happening at local levels right now that I think is somewhat hopeful, but to sort of the point of going after crumbs, I mean, there has not been, I work specifically on housing, so there has been very little investment in housing from the federal level. I mean, it's been cut for not just the past few years, but for decades. And so I think there really, you know, that is where if there was some changing of priorities, I think we could start to make more of a dent on some of these issues as well, particularly when it comes to affordable housing.
Right. So just to repeat the question is, what sort of policies can we do specifically for Black elders who are on fixed income, maybe had a career or had income and now are in retirement or on fixed income, and what are we doing to support them to stay in their homes? And that a lot of the what you're hearing of options out there, like, well, why don't you find some capital to build an ADU in your backyard, isn't recognizing that person's experience, maybe of having experienced redlining and the ways that banks and capital continue to discriminate against Black communities.
Well, the note is, yes, that needs to be raised up higher on our priority list. We don't do housing directly. A way that I would speak to how we would support elders is, in terms of our work, one area would be around public safety, making it safe for them to be able to walk in the street and feeling comfortable. The other would be around food justice, making sure that there's healthy, affordable food available for them that has a direct impact on their nutrition. We're a young adult-centered organization, so I think an approach would be to make sure that we've got some intergenerational activities going, but thank you for the challenge and the charge, and that's what I was writing down, elder support. And so we are in a strategic planning mode as an organization, and that's something I'm going to put to our team.
I'll just say that we are in the process of hiring a planner to work on age-friendly cities, and while I don't think the current iteration of that particular position is really focused on some of those very specific issues. I think it's probably more like accessibility to the home, sidewalk infrastructure, those types of things. But I will definitely be putting that in front of the person that's going to be taking on that position, that this is an issue we need to think about. I do know, again, because I had to go through this list of 113 anti-displacement strategies, that providing assistance for property tax increases is something that's on the list. I think, don't 100% quote me, because this is in our housing bureau, but I think they do provide that type of assistance to homeowners, particularly elderly homeowners. Yeah, and that'll definitely be something I raise back home. I think I actually just read an Atlantic article about a federal policy where you have to repay Medicare or Medicaid cost, and that folks are losing their homes due to that because of state law. So that could be another action for folks who are particularly facing that issue.
Great. I'll just say on that real quickly that another city that participated in our anti-displacement policy network, which isn't up here tonight, but the city of Philadelphia, not only has property tax exemption based on income, but also based on length of time that you've lived in the neighborhood. So a legacy exemption that freezes the property tax value regardless of your income based on being a long-time resident there as a way to help to stabilize communities in that kind of situation. Another area that we've seen this come up is in issues of code enforcement, where particularly for Black homeowners who've lived in redlined neighborhoods, that also means that not only were they denied access to capital to fix up, to buy their home, but also to fix it up. And so when cities use complaint-based code enforcement and you're seeing demographic changes in a neighborhood, we're seeing an increase in code enforcement against Black homeowners whose homes might have been more DIY fixed up over the years or changed in order to adopt to like changing family size. And so cities that have programs that are more proactive in helping people come into compliance without burdening them with costs is another area that we've seen some work that cities have done. Oh, thank you. So the question was, what American cities have the best anti-displacement policies? And I'm not sure that there's a specific city that we can point to and say. I will say that there are some neighborhoods where there's been incredible organizing and action done by the communities that have helped to create a bit more stability than maybe they otherwise would have faced. So I live in the Bay Area, and one neighborhood in particular is in the Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland, where it was a community-based CDC, a community development corporation, that acquired the ability to develop on the parking lot next to the BART station there, and has been developing a community-based transit-oriented development that includes ground floor retail that provides services such as a paycheck cashing store, but it's a nonprofit organization that provides non-predatory paycheck lending and paycheck cashing services for folks who are unbanked in the neighborhood. And this is a predominantly, I should say, Latinx neighborhood in the Fruitvale area. as well as community services, library, health clinics, and mixed income housing. And we've seen in that neighborhood, I don't think because of that development alone, but because of a number of projects where CDCs and nonprofits have gone in and have really controlled the development in that neighborhood, that as we've seen the neighborhood see these new projects come online, we're not seeing the same price increases in that neighborhood as we are elsewhere in Oakland or elsewhere in the Bay Area. So it's been able to be, and when you look demographically, it's been able to stay pretty stable racially. There has been some increase in income in demographically in that neighborhood, but that seems to be because residents in the neighborhood are actually getting into higher paying jobs and not because they're being replaced by other people. Other folks?
And maybe I would just add, from having been part of the Policy Link cohort, it did seem like a lot of the really effective strategies were those that started with community-based organizations on a smaller scale. It seems like, and my sample size is really just the 11 cities that were in our cohort, I think, but it seemed like some of the particularly strong cities where then those policies were embraced more citywide, where Portland, I think, stood out, and Denver as well, doing a lot of interesting things. But again, I think it was, a lot of locally based policies that were starting in community that were really, I think, seemed to be the most compelling that we learned about through our Policy Link cohort.
Thank you. And I'll just add one more piece to this of a few other examples that I can think of in Boston or in San Francisco. And I think one of the common elements in all of those is really community ownership over development. So literally, who owns the land, who owns the building, who's running the planning processes, who's writing those plans. And in, example in Boston, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, the only community organization in the country that's ever gotten the right to eminent domain buildings in its own neighborhood. And that was 20, 30 years ago, and we're still seeing a relatively high percentage of the buildings in that neighborhood are owned in a nonprofit or in some form of community ownership, but non-profit maximizing ownership. And I think that that's just an incredibly important piece to the long-term stability of the community. Not saying that everything needs to become social housing, but that a significant portion of the buildings in a neighborhood, not only the residential but also the commercial, are owned by a land trust, a co-op, a nonprofit, someone who has a mission to keep it affordable and keep it serving the community. And so I just have to say that today, learning about the Liberty Bank building has been so inspiring to see how that's manifesting here in Seattle, and I hope there's more projects like that on the way for you all.
Yeah, something I'd like to add to keep consistent with this Equity Plus Plus is that all of that is great, that we've got cities, even Seattle, that's getting this conscientiousness about equitable development. And but when we mention the housing, we mention economic development, the challenge that I see is missing is the police department supportive, or are they acting as if it didn't happen and they're keeping their same old process? Is the Department of Transportation and how it's managing roads, and is it all in on it? And it almost seems that the efforts, I wouldn't say ring hollow, but surely get somewhat compromised when there are other public entities that haven't themselves bought into that work. And so that's something that we're looking to do, getting young people involved in doing that. But that's just a thought that kind of occurred to me when you were sharing that.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So the question was really around how much is it that to say it in summary, how much can we see that the tech sector is causing particularly cultural displacement in Seattle of artists and creative types, and how much of it might be due to previous planning practices, and I would just add to that, ongoing planning practices.
Yeah, it just seems to me that our artists, that they're one of the more vulnerable groups. right? I mean, they kind of committing to their art. They aren't earning goo gobs of income on it, and so when it comes to the market pressures, they are going to be among those impacted. And I'm thinking about the urban planner's role, and I'm thinking about this ongoing ability of what kind of housing is allowed to be built. I think about what's the apartment pods, what are they? Apartments. So the idea that it's built for a mobile workforce, and the tech group, you know, techies in here, yeah, out you know, but like the whole part of that mentality is I can go to a metropolitan area and get a high-paying job and be there for 3 years and get that money, and then go to another one and be there and get that money. And the folks that the housing that they're moving into is built for folks who have that mobility. And so the more and more of those kinds of living arrangements are allowed, the more that kind of transient mobile population has, you know, the sway in kind of what happens. And sure, you can't deny the value of the taxes that they're paying to help build the city coffers, but you know, at the same time, at what expense? You know, kind of selling your soul.
I would also say, so just going back to like, what can we do? What can organizationally, individually, collectively do is to really, as Katie said and others, just prioritize the value of those spaces, right? Because they're necessary. So in our organization, like, we focus on many different things, but we started an Indigenous women of color space. And it's been a little bit of a challenge sometimes because we are one of the district planning councils in the city of St. Paul. So sometimes we get emails that say, you know, like any other affinity group, you can't really exclude people. And but also, so we've just changed our tactics and how we meet and how we promote when we meet and where we meet. But what I wanted to say was that the more, so other spaces are now holding their own Indigenous women of color spaces. And so we're across the city holding more of those spaces. And our events draw a lot of folks, but every month we always have a lot of women coming together. And I just think it's just gonna take all of us as a collective to be bolder and to actually like push it and force those spaces to be there. And we need to find creative ways to make those things happen.
Thank you. I'll just add to that for the next question that I think this linking together of the people who make up a community and the spaces in which we come together in order to express our culture and express our community is so important, and is something that we'd like to create dichotomies of, oh, is this a people policy or a place policy? And particularly when we're talking about culture making, that's really one and the same. So one of the cities who was in our anti-displacement network, the city of Santa Fe, came into our cohort looking at the history within Santa Fe. In the downtown area, there are these buildings going back to Spanish colonial time that, you know, adobe buildings in the downtown area. And so many years ago, they passed a historic preservation overlay district in that neighborhood to preserve those buildings. But it didn't preserve the people living in those buildings, and so there's been massive displacement. That was an area where native Santa Feans lived, and now it's become an area that's been very central to the tourism economy, but they've been pushed out to further parts of the city or even out of the city altogether. And so they have this idea of a anti-displacement overlay district of, what if we were to take that principle of cultural, of historic preservation that we apply to buildings and have a cultural anti-displacement preservation that protected the people living in these communities in the same way that we value and protect those sort of historic buildings. Thank you. So the question was, We've talked about building coalitions. How do you maintain the coalitions? And how do you value or understand the intergenerational trauma that might exist within those coalitions? How do you value intergenerational trauma? Thank you.
One of the things that I've learned about sustaining coalitions is you need, when partners are behaving badly, you need a practice to work through that. And I've been talking a lot about accountability with unity. Societally, though, it's so much against the grain because as sure as you seek accountability, the trauma, the pressure, that very act is interpreted not as accountability, but as attack, as disparaging, as something now I gotta now dig my heels in on. And it is the undoing of so many potentially great coalitions. When you don't have a practice of accountability with unity. And it's a challenge, I gotta say. One of the things that we've been doing to kind of value the intergenerational trauma, we've adopted restorative justice as a center of what we do. And so we have what we call peace circles, and we train young people to be circle keepers. In our neighborhood, we've been able to utilize a grant from the National Institute of Justice, of all places, to fund circle keepers in the neighborhood so that we can have multiple circles going on at any given time through the course of a week that somebody can just kind of drop in on. But we do want to also just make sure that folks know that they're happening. So really looking at the restorative practices as a way to kind of value that so that when elders and young people are in the same space, that level, that there's a leveling of relationship there, because I got to tell you, our young people these days, and they probably, they're quite prickly, right? So you get them in the space with an elder, you're going to get it. And I tell them, okay, you can cut us, but you got to wait for us to heal before you cut me again. And so the circles really kind of help level that, to kind of minimize the possibility of that happening, because it's real. Again, everybody's just needing to kind of support their own sanity, and some ways that they do it, that's kind of how they do it. But restorative practices, I think, is a key for us, at least, to preserve that and value the intergenerational space.
And I'll add to that. Thank you for sharing that, because that's so important. That's basically the foundation of it, right? And then in addition, I think it's coalitions need to be resourced, because we're pulling all of our resources together, the small amounts that we have, in order to kind of build this power. But I think what I've seen be successful is having kind of a coalition organizer that's able to kind of bring everybody together and kind of set the tone, set the vision based off of a scope of work that the coalition had already established. And then I've seen coalitions just applying for funding from philanthropists out there, or also city agencies, to be able to just say, hey, we need money to do this work, for you to, for us to give you the information that you need to be able to do, work for the city. So resources. You gonna add to that?
Yeah, I just, and it's interesting in Portland, because we fund our neighborhood associations and our neighborhood coalitions, right? Who homeowners, property owners, predominantly white. We fund that, and it's a struggle to fund those coalitions, those community-based groups. However, I'm excited to get back to my hotel room tonight, because there's actually testimony going on at City Council. One of our commissioners recently started to change City Code 3.96, I believe, which the official language of who receives funding, what coalitions receive funding, who do we have to go to for like our official decisions. And they're still working on that, so there's a lot of testimony tonight about that to include coalitions, culturally specific organizations, understanding that community and power doesn't just rest in a recognized geographic neighborhood, especially because of displacement. So the resources, yeah.
Wow. Okay, I just wanted to say when coalition work, stepping back and building slowing down to the pace of trust, right? So like only moving at the speed of trust. And then also thinking about meeting more frequently and also more deeply so that the relationships are strong. And then also agreeing with what you're talking about with accountability, but accountability right from a place of love that actually is more about calling each other in than calling each other out. And then also, when I think what you're talking about too, when we talk about our coalition work, is are we on a shared analysis, going down a shared pathway with shared strategy and shared tactics so that we're all in agreement as we move. You asked about the trauma and how we deal with the generational trauma. So I can just speak for the group that we have with the women, which is moving into all of our organization actually. But we practice something that we call PIES. So it's the physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And so we check in through our PIES when we come together. So it's like 1 through 5, where are you at today with your PIES? And it's just a way to like check in and to be like just to see where we are. And sometimes, you know, we're not in the best of places. So it's getting to that level too.
So just to repeat it for the camera, the question was about to say more about the idea of areas of concentrated white wealth and the problem of wealth hoarding and the way that those communities can maintain exclusionary practices.
So Katie mentioned earlier the Equity in Place table, which is a coalition across the 7 counties that we're in actually, so Minneapolis, St. Paul, and surrounding cities. And this was a terminology that came out of that table just in reference to narrative work as we were talking about areas of concentrated poverty. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. So concentrated areas of white wealth. So there was a study that was done at the Humphrey Cura, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the Humphrey at the University of Minnesota. And basically, one of the things that had come out is that in order to consider a community successful, the community actually was measured by its whiteness. So if you were in a white community, then you were more likely to have a successful, more thriving livelihood. And so after those learnings, we began to have these discussions. So that's from my understanding of why we started using that terminology.
One thing that I can say that's coming better from you than it would from me. So this notion of me raising that issue in those communities would be immediately, you know, referred to me as whining. So it's important that you and the other folks who similar put that message out there, right? Because that's probably the other part of it. I would imagine that they're just not hearing it that often, that it is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. So the question was, what can community development organizations, where are the pressure points that we can apply in order to get to those equity plus policies, or even in communities that aren't necessarily organized as community development organizations, how can we start to organize around these sorts of policies?
I felt need and include young people. So our example is with organization Puget Sound Sage, Rainier Beach Action Coalition, partnered to get young people to look at transit justice. And let me give a shout out to sister in the back, Rebecca Saldana, our wonderful 37th District Representative, who at that time was, she was with Puget Sound Sage. And we got young people looking at policy, but there was a felt need, right? Transportation was an issue for them. One of the policies that they discovered was that you needed to live 2 miles away from your school in order to get free transportation. So, they did a report. They organized people around it. Ultimately, the Freedom Schools, through an organization called Washington Building Leaders of Change, or WALBLOC, organized around it because they saw the felt need of it. And they had young people march from the school district to City Hall, which happened to be 2 miles. And as a result of that work, they got the city council to commit $1 million to free Orca cards for students. And ultimately, the young people kept pressing. And then it was a fortuitous election, right? So then you get a new mayor in, and they want to try to, position themselves a little better. So they say, hey, I'm going to take you one step further, and I'm just going to make it free for everybody, right? For all high school students. But nevertheless, the starting point was the felt need of young people and getting young people involved in the work. And to this day, that was 2010. This is 2019. We still got young people in that work. I think the pressure point was tapping them in and getting adults to see, wow, if they've got the wherewithal and the intestinal fortitude to make this thing, maybe we need to come around and support it. So that's just one example for us.
So I started in this role in 2016, 2019. We went down the scorecard path because we did a community learning, and it was called Action to Equity. So it was West Side Action to Equity. And over a series of months, we brought the community together and had shared learnings about our history, our shared history. And so then the story of who we were as a community and what had happened to our community and where we are today and why those things have happened and why it's set up where we are. So that shared learning brought us to the shared analysis, to the shared strategies. And over those 2 years, it led us into our scorecard work, and that's how we've been able to push the scorecard work through to now where it's being adopted in our city council. So it started with that relationship building and that shared learning through the action equity, but our history and knowing our history and knowing how that played a role in today. So the story of ourselves, the story of all of us together, and the story of where we are now, the story of the collective.
I think one thing that was really effective for us with our anti-displacement policy network team in Minneapolis and St. Paul is it's made up of city council members, city staff, and representatives of community organizations. And we were able to have really informal conversations with one another and build deep relationships. And so I think getting at your question about, pressure points, I think it's having those relationships so then that you can identify them along the way. Because one of the things that I think has been effective for us is when we're in settings where we can just talk informally, we can identify if it's maybe a policy we're trying to that get through city council, can help identify what some of those roadblocks might be. Is it where does the organizing need to happen? Does it need to happen around a certain city department or a certain council member, or do you just need a bigger coalition? So I think just building those relationships in that way to be able to help, because I think every situation is a little bit different. So being able to tap into those informal networks and identify those pressure points for each different policy that you're working on, it can help, I think, long-term be successful in moving things forward.
I mean, the things that are coming up in my mind are the Sunrise Movement and how they're going to city council, they're going to TriMet meetings, they're going to metro meetings in the city of Portland, well, I guess nationally, but from the city of Portland, and saying, this is a crisis and you need to do something about it because it's going to affect me and it's going to affect the generations to come. And you have my future in your hands. And so I think just talking directly to city council, I think, because that's who has the power, and then what I've seen that could work is public humiliation, which is like, ouch, do we really want to do that? But pressure point. So that should be like the last resort, because we're the people that elect, city folks to be in office to do the right thing, to respond to the people. So the power dynamics is actually the people, that are able to elect the city officials, and then they get the planners and everyone else to do the work. So we actually have the power. So I think it's using that in those ways. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Tony, did you want to weigh in? You don't have to.
Yeah, I think just finding other groups where you can find common ground. So like I'm thinking for us, like our climate action plan update is coming up, and we're transitioning to say that anti-displacement is a leading climate action strategy. If we can keep communities of color and frontline communities and youth close to the urban core, then we're gonna see a natural reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But if we continue to displace people to all around the region, that's just gonna keep going up as more people move to the area. So it's an unlikely coalition, a potential unlikely coalition that can come together that have two different means, but may be able to form to really put some pressure on some folks. And then I think someone else mentioned the fortuitous election cycle. Election cycles can always be a good pressure place.
Great. So the question was to Minneapolis about their tenant opportunity to purchase policy, and if there's any funding attached to it and what it is.
Thank you for that question. It's a really great question. And those, I think, are all the questions we're grappling with right now. We are pretty early in developing that policy. And so there are actually four of our 13 council members who are interested in it and working on it, and so we're going to be starting to dig into a lot of those questions about long-term affordability, whether this is focused on naturally occurring affordable housing or applies to housing across the city, kind of those policy details. We have a lot of community engagement still to do, but we did adopt last year an advance notice of sale ordinance for housing that's considered naturally occurring affordable housing, which means it's housing that's affordable to households earning 60% of area median income or less, but does not have a subsidy associated with it. So those building owners are required to provide 60 days notice before they are sold. And then there are post-sale tenant protections that go along with those sales. And so that's sort of our starting point we have for building then this opportunity to purchase policy. So we're really pretty early on in exploring it. We did have folks from Washington, D.C. come out to do what we call a council study session for our city council, which is not a formal council meeting, but a meeting where they just get a presentation and take some learnings. And so we learned a lot. And so, certainly D.C. has put a lot of money into helping tenants organize and purchase buildings. And so it seems as though that's an important piece of making a policy like that successful. But certainly our policymakers in our city are going to have to look at what they want to do and what type of budget we have for that type of policy as well moving forward. So sorry I don't have much more to share, but I think you're asking all the right questions, because those are the questions we're trying to work through right now as we're starting to develop that policy.
And I will just plug that Policy Link through our All In Cities work has developed an All In Cities policy toolkit, and so we have a tool in that toolkit on tenant opportunity to purchase that has links to more resources, examples where cities have done it, or similar policies. So that's at allincities.org, and you can find from there the toolkit and the policy tool.
Sure, thanks for that question. Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, the Minneapolis City Council adopted a new comprehensive plan that does eliminate single-family zoning across the city, and it allows up to triplexes in all parts of the city, and then certain areas are zoned higher than that as well. And it really was grounded in trying to undo redlining and other racist policies from the past. There was a project in the Twin Cities called Mapping Prejudice that had done a lot of work looking at racially restrictive covenants on housing in the city and mapped out where you could find those covenants. And so they did it, I think, in St. Paul too, right? Or is it just Minneapolis?
They did just Minneapolis, but we have the information in St. Paul.
Yeah.
We can share in a minute.
Okay. So they did it in Minneapolis, and if you look at the map that they put together, I mean, it just maps, it just matches the redlining maps, and matches where you see concentrated areas of white wealth in the city, is where those racially restrictive covenants existed. So that work really kind of sparked is one of the things that sparked the conversation. And there was a couple of years of community engagement around moving toward this zoning change. It was certainly not without controversy. There were a lot of people very opposed to it. I think concerned about things like, losing the character of neighborhoods, and in neighborhoods where, it's probably unlikely that a lot of the houses are going to be torn down to build triplexes. And so it was and I don't want to take credit for this work. Our long-range planning team did tremendous work, community engagement. We got thousands and thousands of public comments that they went through, but really we had the political elected leadership that was really committed to doing this as well, and so it was a combination of I think really strong community engagement, and then the commitment at the elected official level to making that change happen. But the other thing I think is just important to note that while this is big, it was a big change for us and a big policy change, I don't think that in and of itself is not going to solve the affordable housing crisis that we have in our city. Certainly trying to increase supply is part of it, but at the same time, the city is also making a lot of new investment in developing affordable housing, because recognizing that a zoning change alone isn't going to solve those issues. So I think in terms of anti-displacement strategies that came out of it, it's other things to go along with that policy. So it's some of the tenant protections I was talking about earlier, and increased investment in affordable housing, and sort of a number of NOAA preservation strategies, trying to have a really holistic approach to addressing these issues. And the zoning change has been getting a lot of attention, and it's exciting, but I think everybody recognizes that we need to do more than that on its own.
In St. Paul, so we're one community in the city of St. Paul. There's several communities there, but we did about 2 or 3 years of also study in the neighborhood. So we also rezoned an entire ward or corridor in our area to allow for more housing. And we also had to get our council person on board, and it took about 3 years to happen. And we also had areas of concentrated white wealth come out and say that it would change the character of the neighborhood. And there was a lot of pushback, and it took a long time, but that also happened. So it can happen on a large municipality scale, but neighborhoods can do it too. So just to say that it can happen neighborhood by neighborhood.
Great. I forgot to do this for the last question, but just to repeat the question here was around if any of the cities have done strategies to address segregation, and specifically looking at the high level of segregation in our schools and the way that harms our students.
Well, that's that again. That got to be consistent with the term equity plus plus. We can make these changes on the ground, but if the school districts aren't part of mimicking that and other institutions aren't, just kind of rings a little hollow.
Intersection of housing and.
Yeah, I don't know that I really have an answer to that question specifically, but we are trying to partner more with the school district in just thinking about housing policy as well. We have a program that we modeled actually after one in Tacoma around rental assistance for families with kids in school and trying to prevent school instability. I don't think that gets at your question about segregation in schools, but so I think just recognizing that, yeah, housing is a foundation for stability, and schools are an important part of that picture. But anyway, we're trying to partner more, but I don't know that I have a great answer to your question.
I would like to say thank you for asking that question and just making that acknowledgement in the room, because before being at 1000 Friends of Oregon, I was a Youth Essentials Coordinator at a local high school in Portland, well, in Gresham, which is city close to Portland. And it was a high concentrated area of students on free and reduced lunch, and a lot of the students were at that. Most of the students that were students of color were at that high school because they had been displaced from their neighborhoods and because of gentrification. And so their performance, they came into our room a lot, and we provided emotional support for those students just because it was a hard cultural shift for them to make, to come to a school that was so far out from their neighborhoods. And the reason that I'm in this work right now is because I recognize we need to have policy change for those young people that, based out of their control, they're suffering. They're suffering with like housing insecurity, food insecurity, and just a huge cultural shift and cultural shock that impacts the way that they perform in school and impacts their wantingness to perform in school. And being in rooms where they don't see the teacher that looks like them, or they don't even see students that look like them, and then they don't want to be there, and then they don't perform well, and then we know the outcomes of that. So appreciate that question, and that's kind of my motivation for the work that I do.
Thank you, everybody. Excellent questions. And a round of applause for the panel, please.